The door to the Apostolic Palace slammed shut at 2:47 in the morning. Inside, 3 cardinals stood frozen. On the desk in front of them lay a single document, unsigned, but already printed on official paper letterhead. Cardinal Sandre picked it up. His hands were shaking. He read the first line. Then he looked at the other 2 men and whispered, "He is going to destroy everything we have built." 700 years of tradition gone with one signature, and Pope Leo XIV had not even told them he was doing it. The story of what happened inside the Vatican between July 1st and July 4th, 2026 will be remembered as one of the most dramatic chapters in church history. Not because of a scandal, not because of a crisis, but because one man decided that a tradition older than the Vatican itself, older than the building, older than the walls, older than the very idea of a Vatican City, had to die, and once he killed it, there was no bringing it back. Before we continue with the story, if you are watching this, do something simple. Click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your support means everything and keeps these stories alive. It started with a phone call. On the night of June 30th, Pope Leo XIV was alone in his private study on the 3rd floor of the Casa Santa Marta. He had been living there since taking office in May of 2025, refusing to move into the Grand Papal Apartments. That decision alone had raised eyebrows, but what he did next went far beyond symbolic gestures. At approximately 9 p.m., he called Archbishop Giovanni Ferrara, the head of the Vatican's Office for Financial Oversight. Ferrara had held the position for 11 years. He knew every number, every account, every hidden transfer. "Giovanni," the Pope said, "I need every financial record from the Institute for the Works of Religion on my desk by tomorrow morning. Every one." Ferrara paused. "Your Holiness, those records fall under pontifical secrecy." "I know what they fall under," Leo replied. "That is exactly why I am calling." The line went quiet for a moment. Then the Pope added something that Ferrara would later describe as the most terrifying sentence he had ever heard from a superior. "Pontifical secrecy ends this week." Pontifical secrecy. Most people outside the Church have never even heard the term. But inside the Vatican, it is the single most powerful shield in existence. It is not a policy. It is not a guideline. It is a sacred oath, a centuries-old system of enforced silence that governs how information moves within the Holy See. Every priest, bishop, cardinal, and lay official who works in the Roman Curia takes this oath. Break it, and you face excommunication. Not suspension, not a warning. Excommunication. That is how seriously the Church has taken this tradition for over 700 years. Its roots go back to the 13th century, long before there was a Vatican City, long before the Lateran Treaty of 1929 gave the Church its sovereign territory. The tradition of pontifical secrecy predates all of that. It was codified under Pope Clement V during the Council of Vienne in 1312. It was expanded under Pius X in 1908. It was reinforced under Pius XII, under John Paul II, under Benedict XVI, and under Francis. Every single pope in modern history had looked at this tradition, recognized its flaws, and decided to leave it intact. Some tinkered at the edges. Francis in 2019 loosened secrecy requirements for clergy abuse cases. But the core system, the oath, the penalty, the culture of silence remained untouched until now. Because what Leo XIV was about to do had never been attempted by any pope in history. He was not reforming secrecy. He was not loosening it. He was abolishing it entirely. And what most people did not know was that he had been planning this for months. Since before the Lampedusa trip was announced, since before his Africa visit in April, since the very first week of his pontificate, when he sat alone in Casa Santa Marta and read through the confidential briefing files that every incoming pope receives, files about the true state of the Church finances, its legal exposure, and its deepest internal crisis. Those files had kept him awake for 3 nights straight, and they had changed him. The next morning, July the 1st, Archbishop Ferrara arrived at Casa Santa Marta at 6:15 a.m. with 2 aides carrying sealed boxes. Inside were printed summaries of the Vatican Bank's financial activity over the past 20 years, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, wire transfers to accounts in Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands, loan guarantees for construction projects in South America and Africa. Ferrara placed the boxes on the table in the Pope's private dining room. Leo XIV was already seated. He had a cup of black coffee in front of him, no food. He did not look up. "Sit down," the Pope said. Ferrara sat. Leo opened the first folder. He scanned the page in silence, then the second, then the third. After roughly 10 minutes, he closed the folder and placed both hands flat on the table. "How much of this has ever been audited by an external body?" Ferrara hesitated. External audits were initiated under Pope Francis, Your Holiness, but they were limited in scope and subject to pontifical secrecy. Leo finished. Ferrara nodded. So the auditors could look, but not speak. Another nod. Leo leaned forward. Then they were not auditors, Giovanni. They were witnesses, who were silenced. That sentence would define the next 72 hours. What most people do not understand is that pontifical secrecy did not just protect financial data, it covered everything. Abuse investigations, internal disciplinary hearings, diplomatic correspondence, personnel files of every bishop, cardinal, and nuncio, medical records of popes, even the voting records of papal conclaves. For 7 centuries, this tradition had been treated as untouchable, not because it was in scripture, not because it was dogma, but because it served a purpose. It protected the institution. It shielded the church from embarrassment, from accountability, from the kind of scrutiny that every other global institution had been forced to accept, and Leo XIV had decided it was over. But what he found in those boxes was worse than he expected. By midday on July 1st, Leo had locked himself in his study. He told his personal secretary, Father Thomas Brennan, to cancel all afternoon appointments. No visitors, no calls, no exceptions. Inside the study, the Pope read page after page, file after file. He used a red pen to mark entries that concerned him. Within 2 hours, nearly every page had red marks. What emerged was not a single scandal. It was a pattern, a system of financial routing that had been operating for decades, moving money between Vatican-controlled entities and external accounts with almost no documentation. Some transfers were small, a few thousand here or there, labeled as administrative expenses. Others were enormous. One single wire transfer in 2014 moved $47 million to a holding company in Panama. The stated purpose, charitable infrastructure. The actual recipient, unknown. A second transfer in 2017 sent $23 million to a real estate fund in London. The property purchased with that money was later sold at a massive loss. A third file showed a series of payments totaling over 60 million euros to intermediaries in Italy whose identities were shielded behind layers of shell companies. And buried deep in the second box was something even more disturbing, a folder labeled Personnel Actions Restricted. Inside were records of 37 clergy members who had been reassigned between 2002 and 2018. Every reassignment followed the same pattern: an allegation, an internal investigation, a finding, and then a transfer. Not a prosecution, not a public accounting, a transfer to a new diocese in a new country with a clean file. 37 times the same system had been used, and every single time it had been protected by pontifical secrecy. Leo set the folder down. He stared at the wall for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Cardinal Pietro Moretti, the Secretary of State. "Pietro, I need you at Santa Marta in 1 hour. Your Holiness, I am in a meeting with the diplomatic. 1 hour. Moretti arrived at 3 p.m. He found the Pope standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Sit," Leo said without turning around. Moretti sat. He noticed the boxes, he noticed the open folders, and he noticed something else. A draft document printed on cream-colored paper with the papal seal at the top. "What is that?" Moretti asked. Leo turned. He walked to the desk, picked up the document, and placed it directly in front of the cardinal. "Read it." Moretti's eyes moved across the page. The color drained from his face within seconds. The document was a papal motu proprio, a legislative act issued by the Pope on his own authority. It was titled De Veritate Ecclesiae, on the truth of the Church, and it contained 7 articles that would dismantle the entire framework of pontifical secrecy. Article 1 abolished the oath of pontifical secrecy for all financial matters. Article 2 required full external audits of every Vatican financial entity to be conducted by independent firms and published annually. Article 3 opened all historical abuse investigation files going back to 1950 to a newly created independent review commission. Article 4 mandated that all diplomatic correspondence between the Holy See and sovereign nations be archived and made available to scholars after a 15-year declassification period. Article 5 eliminated the secrecy requirement for internal disciplinary proceedings against clergy accused of crimes. Article 6 created a permanent office of transparency, reporting directly to the Pope, with authority to investigate any department of the Roman Curia. Article 7 declared that no future pope could reinstate pontifical secrecy without the consent of a 2/3 majority of the College of Cardinals, effectively making the abolition irreversible. Moretti finished reading. He set the paper down slowly. "Your Holiness," he said, "this will cause a war." Leo sat down across from him. "The war already happened, Pietro. We just hid the casualties." That night, word began to leak. Not to the press, not yet, but through the corridors of the Vatican itself. A senior official in the Secretariat of State told a colleague. That colleague told a Monsignor. The Monsignor called a cardinal in Munich. By midnight on July 1st, at least 14 senior church officials knew what was coming, and the resistance began almost immediately. Cardinal Raymond Burke, one of the most vocal traditionalists in the church, reportedly called 3 other cardinals that same night. His message was blunt. This document could not be signed. If it was, the institutional foundations of the church would be exposed to secular interference on a scale never seen before. Burke's argument was not without logic. The tradition of pontifical secrecy had served a specific function. It preserved the church independence. Without it, governments could subpoena Vatican records. Prosecutors could access internal investigations. Journalists could request diplomatic files. The church would be treated not as a sovereign spiritual authority, but as a corporation subject to external regulation. But Leo saw it differently. He had spent months reviewing what secrecy it actually protected, and the answer was not the church mission. It was the church failures. On the morning of July 2nd, Leo called a private meeting in the Sala Bologna, a small room inside the Apostolic Palace used for confidential sessions. He invited 12 cardinals, not the full college, just 12. The men who entered that room represented the full spectrum of the church internal politics. Progressives, moderates, traditionalists, men who had supported his election, men who had voted against him. Leo stood at the head of the table. He did not sit. He spoke for less than 5 minutes. "Brothers," he began, "I did not call you here to ask permission. I called you here to explain what I am about to do and why." He paused. The room was absolutely silent. For 7 centuries, this church has operated behind a wall of secrecy that was built to protect the faith. But somewhere along the way, it stopped protecting the faith and started protecting the institution. And in doing so, it allowed things to happen inside these walls that should never have been tolerated. Financial corruption, the concealment of abuse, the silencing of victims, the shielding of men who committed crimes in the name of God. He looked around the table. "I will not carry that weight, and I will not pass it to my successor." Cardinal Sandre was the first to speak. "Your Holiness, the consequences of this are irreversible. Once you open these files, they cannot be closed again." "That is precisely the point," Leo replied. Cardinal Luis Tagle, who had supported Leo's election and remained one of his closest allies, spoke next. "I support the direction, Holy Father, but the timing concerns me. The Church is still stabilizing after the transition. Are we ready for what comes out of those files?" Leo's answer was immediate. "The victims were not given the luxury of timing, Luis. Neither will we." The room erupted, not in anger, not yet, but in overlapping voices. Cardinals who had spent decades working within the system tried to process what they were hearing. Some asked practical questions. How would declassification work? What about ongoing legal cases? What about the privacy of clergy who had been falsely accused? Leo answered each question calmly, methodically. He had anticipated every objection. He had spent months thinking through the logistics, consulting quietly with canon lawyers outside the Curia, lawyers who owed no loyalty to the institution and had no reason to protect it. Cardinal Robert McElroy of San Diego leaned forward. "Holy Father, I have spent my career arguing for reform. I believe in transparency, but I need to ask you something directly. Ask, are you prepared for what will happen when the abuse files become public? Because I can tell you from the American experience, it will not be orderly. It will not be calm. It will be a flood." Leo met his eyes. "I am not afraid of floods, Robert. I am afraid of what happens when the water has nowhere to go." The meeting lasted 90 minutes. When the cardinals left, none of them spoke to reporters. None of them issued statements, but the expression on their faces told the story. Something historic was about to happen. 3 of the 12 cardinals walked out visibly shaken. 2 others left with their jaws set, their stride purposeful. Men who had just been given permission to do what they had wanted to do for years. The remaining 7 moved in silence, processing the weight of what they had just witnessed, and not everyone was on board. That same afternoon, Cardinal Gerhard Müller released a private memorandum to a select group of European cardinals. The memo was not leaked to the press until days later, but its contents were explosive. Müller argued that the abolition of pontifical secrecy was not merely a policy change. It was an assault on the ecclesial sovereignty of the Holy See. He compared it to stripping a nation of its classified intelligence. He warned that it would embolden prosecutors in Germany, Australia, and the United States to launch new investigations into decades-old abuse cases, investigations that could drag sitting cardinals into secular courtrooms. The memo concluded with a single line: A church without secrets is a church without sovereignty. When Leo was told about the memo, he responded with 4 words. Sovereignty requires moral authority. By the evening of July 2nd, the Vatican press office was overwhelmed. Reporters from every major news outlet had received anonymous tips. Something major was coming. Something involving the Pope, the Vatican Bank, and a centuries-old tradition. No one had the full picture yet, but the fragments alone were enough to dominate every news cycle on the planet. Inside the Vatican, the atmosphere was described by one priest as electric and terrifying. Leo spent the evening alone. He ate a simple dinner. He prayed in his private chapel, and at approximately 10 p.m., he made one final revision to the motu proprio. He added a preamble. It read, "The Church of Christ was not built on secrecy. It was built on a rock, and rocks do not hide." On the morning of July 3rd, Pope Leo XIV signed the motu proprio de veritate ecclesiae in a private ceremony witnessed by Cardinal Moretti, Archbishop Ferrara, and the Pope's personal secretary, Father Brennan. There were no cameras, no fanfare, just a signature, a seal, and a date. At 11 a.m., the Vatican press office released the full text of the document. Within minutes, it was the top story on every major news platform in the world. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. The New York Times described it as the most significant internal reform in the Catholic Church since the Second Vatican Council. The Guardian called it a seismic rupture in the oldest surviving institution on earth. Reuters reported that legal teams in at least 6 countries were already preparing to file requests for access to abuse investigation archives. Inside the Church, the response was deeply divided. Cardinal Cupich of Chicago, long considered an ally of Leo's, released a statement of full support within 2 hours. "This is what the gospel demands," he wrote. "Light exposes what darkness hides." Cardinal Burke, by contrast, issued a terse statement calling the document an act of institutional self-harm and urging the College of Cardinals to convene an emergency session. The German Bishops' Conference, which had been pushing for greater transparency for years, expressed cautious support, but noted that the practical implementation would be extraordinarily complex. Survivors' advocacy groups around the world responded with a mixture of relief and skepticism. The Survivors' Network of those abused by priests released a statement saying, "We have heard promises before. What matters now is what comes out of those files." And in newsrooms from Washington to Sydney, editors mobilized teams of investigative journalists. The race to obtain and analyze the Vatican's newly opened records had begun. But what happened next caught everyone off guard. On the afternoon of July 3rd, just hours after the motu proprio was published, a sealed envelope was delivered to the Vatican press office. It was addressed to the Pope. It contained a formal letter signed by 11 cardinals. The letter was not a request, it was a demand. The 11 cardinals, 7 Europeans, 2 from Latin America, 1 from Africa, and 1 from North America, argued that the motu proprio violated canonical tradition and exceeded the Pope's authority. They demanded that Leo suspend the document, pending a formal review by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The letter was unprecedented. In modern church history, no group of cardinals had ever formally challenged a sitting pope's legislative authority in writing. When Leo received the letter, he read it once, then he placed it on his desk, folded his hands, and looked at Father Brennan. "How many?" Leo asked. 11, Your Holiness." "Out of how many?" 226. Leo nodded. Then 215 did not sign. He picked up a pen and wrote a single line on the back of the envelope. The document stands. That evening, Vatican Radio broadcast a brief statement from the Pope. It was less than 60 seconds long, but every word carried weight. "Today I signed a document that will change how this church operates. Some of my brothers disagree. I respect their conscience, but I will not reverse a decision that protects the innocent and exposes the truth. The church does not belong to its leaders. It belongs to its people, and its people deserve honesty." The statement ended with a phrase that would be printed on front pages around the world the following morning. "We were built on a rock, not on silence." July 4th arrived quietly. Leo celebrated morning mass in the chapel at Casa Santa Marta. Only a handful of staff were present. He delivered a short homily about courage, not the courage of war, but the courage of honesty. Later that day, he flew to Lampedusa. The visit had been planned for months, a pastoral trip to the island that had become a symbol of the migrant crisis. But in light of what had just happened, the trip took on a new meaning. Standing on the shores of Lampedusa, looking out at the Mediterranean, where thousands of migrants had lost their lives trying to reach Europe, Leo spoke to a crowd of migrants, local residents, aid workers, and journalists. The wind off the sea pressed against his white cassock. He gripped the edges of the lectern. He did not mention the motu proprio directly. He did not need to. "The world tells you to hide," he said. "It tells you your story is too painful, too inconvenient, too dangerous. But I tell you, your story is the truth, and truth is the only thing worth protecting." He paused, his voice dropped lower. "I know what it means to watch an institution choose silence over honesty. I know what it costs. And I am telling you today, oh, the cost is too high for you, for your children, for this church, for the world." The crowd erupted not in applause, in tears. A woman in the front row, a migrant from Eritrea, who had survived a shipwreck 3 years earlier, covered her face with her hands. A Lampedusa fisherman, who had pulled bodies from the water for over a decade, stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, nodding slowly. Back in Rome, the machinery of change was already grinding into motion. The newly created Office of Transparency had been given temporary quarters in a wing of the Palazzo della Cancelleria. A team of 8 four-canon lawyers, 2 forensic accountants, and 2 archivists began cataloging the first wave of declassified documents. Their initial review would take months, but within the first 48 hours, they had already flagged over 300 files for immediate review. These included financial records that had never been seen by anyone outside the Vatican bank's inner circle, personnel files of clergy who had been quietly transferred between dioceses after allegations of misconduct, and diplomatic cables that revealed conversations between the Holy See and several governments about the handling of abuse cases. The files painted a picture that was both damning and deeply human. They showed an institution that had struggled, genuinely struggled with how to balance justice and mercy, transparency and protection, truth and survival. But they also showed moments of deliberate concealment, moments when the choice was made not because it was right, but because it was easier. And now, for the first time in 7 centuries, those moments would be seen by the world. The conservative backlash intensified throughout the week. Traditionalist media outlets accused Leo of surrendering the church to secular powers. An anonymous editorial in a prominent Catholic journal compared the motu proprio to the sack of Rome in 1527. A dramatic overstatement, but one that captured the emotional intensity of the opposition. In certain corners of the Vatican, the resistance took a more subtle form. 2 senior monsignors in the Secretariat of State quietly began delaying the transfer of files to the new Office of Transparency. They claimed logistical issues, insufficient storage, missing indexes, damaged documents, but their real intention was clear to everyone who understood how the Curia worked. They were stalling. When Leo learned about the delays on the evening of July 3rd, he did not send a memo. He did not make a phone call. He walked personally to the Secretariat of State offices at 8 p.m., unannounced with no security detail, wearing his simple white cassock. He found the 2 monsignors at their desks. "The files," he said simply, "by morning." Neither man argued, neither man made excuses. They looked at the Pope standing in their doorway, and they understood that the era of passive resistance was over. The files were delivered by 6 a.m., but Leo did not waver. He never wavered. On the evening of July 4th, after returning from Lampedusa, the Pope sat alone in his study. The lights of Rome glowed through the window. His phone rang. It was Cardinal Tagle. "How are you, Holy Father?" Tagle asked. Leo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I signed a piece of paper, Luis. That is all I did. The truth was already there. I just stopped hiding it." Tagle paused. "The 11 cardinals are talking about a formal response." "Let them talk," Leo said. "That is what transparency means. Everyone gets to speak." There was a long silence. "Do you think it will survive your pontificate?" Tagle asked. Leo leaned back in his chair. "Article 7 requires a 2/3 majority to reverse it. That means 75% of the college would have to vote to return to secrecy in public with the world watching." He paused. "No one will cast that vote, Luis. Not anymore." The implications of de veritate ecclesiae would unfold over months and years. Legal requests from prosecutors in multiple countries were filed within the first week. Academic institutions petitioned for access to the diplomatic archives. Abuse survivors, lawyers, began preparing cases that had been blocked for decades by the secrecy shield. Inside the Vatican, the cultural shift was seismic. Officials who had spent entire careers operating under the assumption that internal matters were untouchable now found themselves answering questions they had never been asked before. Some adapted, some resisted, some resigned. But the tradition itself, the 700-year-old system of enforced institutional silence, was gone. Not weakened, not modified, gone. And Article 7 ensured it could never come back. In the days that followed, a Vatican historian was asked by a reporter whether any precedent existed for what Leo had done. The historian thought for a long time before answering. "The closest comparison," he said, "would be the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. But even that did not touch the secrecy framework. What Leo did goes beyond reform. He changed the operating system of the church. The reporter pressed further. Will history judge him as a hero or a reckless reformer? The historian smiled. That depends on what comes out of those files. What most people missed in those chaotic first days was something quieter. Something that happened not in Rome, not in newsrooms, not in courthouses, but in parishes. In small churches around the world, priests read about the motu proprio and felt something they had not felt in years: relief. A parish priest in Dublin told his congregation that Sunday, for the first time in my life, I feel like the church is telling the truth about itself, and that gives me hope. A retired bishop in the Philippines wrote a personal letter to Leo. It was 2 pages long. It described a case from 1998. A priest in his diocese who had been accused of abuse. The bishop had reported it to Rome. Rome had responded with a directive: handle it internally under pontifical secrecy. The bishop had complied. The priest was transferred. The victim was never told. I have carried this for 28 years. The bishop wrote, I obeyed the system, and the system was wrong. Thank you for ending it. Leo read the letter alone. He folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. Then he closed his eyes and sat in silence for a very long time. Thousands of miles away in a small parish in Lima, Peru, the country where Robert Francis Prevost had spent some of the most formative years of his life, a priest pinned a copy of the motu proprio to the church bulletin board. Underneath it, he wrote a single line in Spanish: La verdad nos hará libres. The truth will set us free. By the time the sun set on July 4th, 2026, the Catholic Church had entered a new era, not because the Pope had created something new, but because he had destroyed something old, something that had protected the powerful at the expense of the powerless for longer than anyone alive could remember. Some traditions die quietly. They fade over generations, eroded by time and changing attitudes, until one day someone notices they are gone and wonders when it happened. This was not one of those deaths. Pope Leo XIV did not let pontifical secrecy fade. He did not allow it to erode. He put it on a table, held it up to the light, showed the world exactly what it had been hiding, and then he destroyed it deliberately, permanently, with Article 7, ensuring that no successor could rebuild it without exposing themselves as a defender of darkness over truth. He did not give a triumphant speech. He did not hold a press conference. He did not celebrate. He went to his chapel. He knelt on the cold stone floor and he prayed, not for himself, not for the church as an institution, but for the people who had been silenced, for the victims whose stories had been locked in sealed files, for the priests who had been forced to choose between obedience and conscience, for every person who had ever been told that the truth was too dangerous to share. He prayed because he knew what was coming next would be harder than anything he had ever done. Opening files was one thing. Facing what was inside them publicly, honestly, without the shield that had protected every pope before him, was something else entirely. But Robert Francis Prevost, the kid from Chicago's South Side, the Augustinian friar who had walked the dusty roads of Peru, the quiet cardinal who had never sought the spotlight, had not become Pope Leo XIV to be comfortable. He had become Pope to be honest. The files were open, the truth was out, and the church would never be the same. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. The truth matters, and so does your support. Leave a comment below. Tell us what you think Leo XIV's legacy will be. We read every single one.